Welcome to today's IGC event, The Impact of COVID-19 on Households in India. I am Pranab Sen, Program Director for IGC in India. I will moderate today's session. Before we get started, let's review a few housekeeping items. All attendees have been muted to minimize background noise. If you have a question during the presentation, please type them into the Q&A box, which you can access at the bottom of your screen. We are going to have a designated time at the end of the panel discussion to answer questions. So please type in your questions in the Q&A box. Please make sure to include your full name and organizational affiliation. We are recording today's session, and a video and audio recording will be made available on IGC's website. I'd also like to point out that there will be a brief survey immediately following today's presentation. So please take a minute to fill that out later on, as your feedback is very important to us. Please feel free to contribute to the conversation online by using hashtag IGC COVID-19. The impact of COVID-19 on household welfare in India has been devastating. Nearly 84% of Indian households experienced losses in income since the first lockdown last year. As a consequence, expenditures fell by more than a third for poorer households, both in rural and urban areas. Families shifted consumption from nutritious to cheaper foods, ate less frequently, and spent less on healthcare. While there were a few months where COVID seemed to be under control, we are now entering a deadly second wave of the virus. Impact on household welfare will be felt through the curbing of economic activity again, but more seriously will be felt through the direct impact of the virus itself. Today's event discusses evidence on the short and long-term impacts of the virus, the policies implemented to curb it, and their effects on household welfare. We will focus primarily on evidence from the previous lockdown and the government relief package. But we will also discuss lessons learned and policy options for the future. Let me now introduce our panelists. On our panel today, we have two experienced researchers, and as of now, we had two senior policymakers, but as of now, we have only one. I will come to it shortly. We will be seeing presentations from the two research studies, after which we will move to a general discussion and then open it up to audience questions at the end. In the panel, we have Ms. Harjot Kaur, who is the Managing Director of the Women's Development Cooperation in Bihar. And among the research presentations, we would first have Ashwini Deshpande, who is Professor of Economics at Ashoka University, and Gaurav Dutt, Associate Professor at the Department of Economics, Monash University in Australia. I'd like to welcome our expert presenters and panelists to discuss this challenging and important topic. May I now turn the screen over to our first presenter, Professor Ashwini Deshpande. Ashwini, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Sen. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you to the IGC for selecting our project for funding, and from which I'm going to share a few results today. This was a joint application along with Josh Murfeld at KDI Seoul, Kritika Saxena, and Laura Vanderwalle from the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies, Geneva. And we got selected to do a study on COVID-19 and the role of SHGs, the self-help groups, in India. So, as is now by now fairly well known, in 2020 last year, when the pandemic hadn't really hit India in a big way, the Indian economy completely locked down. It was a very sudden and total stoppage of all economic activity. And so the research question that we wanted to examine was, how did households cope with this very sudden and total negative shock? And the Indian lockdown, by all parameters, was amongst the most stringent in the world. What we did was that we partnered with with an NGO called Pradhan, which is active in several states of India. But we focused on one state, and I will talk about our sample. The idea was how to check, to partner with them to evaluate how members of self-help groups coped and managed during the lockdown and afterwards in subsequent weeks as the economy unlocked. So we look at a range of indicators for the SHG members as well as their families, but today I will present only a few results. We sampled 400 current SHG members who are members of SHGs run by this group called Pradhan. These members were spread over 80 gram panchayats, which is the rural local body, and spread over 7 districts in rural Madhya Pradesh. We started with a baseline interview, which was conducted at the end of June. And then we did 9 rounds of follow-up interviews with members. So we started around the middle of July and went on till the middle of November 2020. So we wanted to track how they were coping and how their coping strategies changed as the economy unlocked. In addition to the self-help group members, we also sampled members of the Gram Panchayat, which is the rural local body, as well as frontline health workers. So we had about 159 frontline health workers that we interviewed every month. We chose 3 frontline health workers: the ASHAs, the ANMs, the auxiliary nurses and midwives, and the Anganwadi workers. And this field work was done across 7 districts in Madhya Pradesh. So the green state in the map of India is Madhya Pradesh, and our study districts are also marked in green inside the map of Madhya Pradesh. Now, of course, this had to be a phone survey because of the strict lockdown. And so all the limitations that are associated with phone surveys are equally applicable to us as well. But we had an excellent team of enumerators who helped us. And the fact that they had worked with, they had close association with Pradhan helped to ensure the quality of the data. Now, as I said, there are a number of results in our study, and I'm not going to go through all of them because there are too many for me to be able to fit into the short deadline that I have, time limit. So I'm going to be mainly focusing on the most important indicator that we found variation in, which is food insecurity. So we asked 4 questions to our respondents to judge their extent of food security. What were those 4 questions? 1, did they eat cheaper meals? Did they limit the size of their meals? Did they eat fewer meals? And did they borrow or receive food from others? And we asked these questions about how many days in the last week. So in the graph that I'm about to show you, a higher point in the graph means greater number of days. So that denotes higher food insecurity. I apologize for the faint colors in this graph. We were trying to be using a jazzy color palette, but it's actually on the screen, it's not looking so clear. So on the left-hand side, we have savings and income. And on the right-hand side, we have food security. And I'm going to move more to food security. Basically, on the left-hand side graph, you see 4 lines: liquid savings, illiquid savings, total savings, and total labor income, which is the yellow line, which is fluctuating. overall, we see an increase, gradual increase in savings over time. Now, our interpretation of that is that if we had been able to do the survey just at the time of lockdown, which we were not, remember that our baseline was done at the end of June, and the lockdown was announced at the end of March. So our interpretation of this sort of upward trend is that households must have run down their savings at the time of the lockdown, and as the economy gradually unlocked, they built back their savings somewhat. Now, if you look at total labor income, that actually is fairly volatile. There is no clear pattern of up and down, and this could be just very very local factors that were affecting the total labor income. But our strongest and the most interesting results come in the food security module. And as I said before, the higher the graph, which means greater is the food insecurity. So the good news is that over the nine interviews, food security positions of the households improved. There was a bit of fluctuation, but by and large, you find that food insecurity went down. But we find that households ate cheaper food about 35% of the time. So they did substitute by in terms of cost of food items. So that is an indicator of food security that we find strong results on. Now, then we also looked at how this varied by landholding and how this varied by savings quartile. So basically, we divided up our respondents into four quartiles of different kinds of savings and then looked at their food security position according to their position in the savings quartile. So we did total savings, liquid savings, illiquid savings, and grain savings, right? And you see those, four panels on the screen. And overall, we find the expected results, which is that the higher up you are in the savings quartile, the lower is the food insecurity. And as you taper down to the end of the study period, the differences between the quartiles, particularly for liquid savings quartiles, vanish. So basically, there is no difference by liquid savings quartiles. By illiquid savings, we do see differences persisting uh, all the way to the end of our study period. And for liquid as well as for illiquid saving, we find that the lower uh, the household was in the savings quartile, the greater was the food insecurity. The only exception to this is the grain savings, where we find that households in the second quartile of the grain savings had the highest food insecurity. And we don't know yet why that might be the case. So it would be good for me to get answers from my fellow panelists about why they think this might be happening. We need to explore, what other interactions were going on in order to that explain these results. We also asked questions about agricultural production and just asked respondents to recall compared to the previous year. So this is, of course, a recall. And we find that in our study period, households used more household labor and less hired labor compared to last year. And they paid more both for labor and for non-labor costs. It could be because there were very few non-farm opportunities, employment opportunities available to the households. And so they put in more household labor because they didn't have anywhere else to go to in terms of work. Um, but labor costs were definitely higher. And given that their own labor incomes are volatile, so putting the two together, it does point towards some degree of increased distress for the households. Now, remember that we did this study amongst self-help group members, and all over India, there are reports of SHGs coming to the aid of their members to help them tide over this very difficult time during the first lockdown. And indeed, in our study areas, we find exactly the same thing, which is that the Pradhan SHGs help their members in some form or the other, um, to help them tide over the time. Now, the solid line in this graph is any help received from SHGs, and the dashed lines are conditional on receiving help. What was the area in which they got help? So we find about 40% of the household saying that they definitely received help from the SHGs. And conditional on them receiving help, the two most important areas where members received help from the SHGs was food distribution and information. And both of these, as you know, you saw the link with food security. And so food was definitely one of the very important concerns for the households, food insecurity. And this has come not just from our study, but pretty much across all the studies that were done during the lockdown. So the main conclusion that we draw from our study in terms of policy is that the food security concerns of the households are paramount. They were paramount last year. They continue to be paramount this year. Last year, when the lockdown suddenly happened, several institutions and organizations and researchers, including all of us who are on this panel, came up with recommendations about how to relieve the distress of the large informal workforce, of migrant workers, and of households. Unfortunately, most of those recommendations have not really been followed. The government did announce a One Nation, One Ration Card scheme, which was started in June 2020. And the idea behind this ONOR scheme was to enable migrant workers to receive their entitled food grains on the basis of their Aadhaar card in any ration shop in the country. So the idea is that if they are migrants, they should not be deprived of essential food. Today's Indian Express reports that the total uptake of the scheme has been pitifully low. Overall, over the last year, barely 50,000 transactions have been reported. Transactions have been reported. It's been marked by all kinds of logistical glitches. And in any case, the utility of the Aadhaar-based identification system, there are reports that have been mounting in terms of how difficult it has been to access Aadhaar, to access ration based upon Aadhaar cards. So one of the things that we think should be done based upon our studies, first of all, remove Aadhaar linkage. There is no need to have one nation, one ONOR. Just make PDS universal. The government has excess food grains stocks, and repeatedly, there's been a chorus of demand to say release the food grains for those who need them. But food grain is not enough. People need cash for taking care of the very minimal basic needs at the time of this very difficult lockdown. And this year, it's the urgency is even greater because in addition to the lockdown, now the disease has hit us with a vengeance, which was not so rampant last year when we did our study. So this year, actually, the situation is far more challenging than last year. And if food security was so important last year, this year it is even more important, particularly at the time when people are literally, hit by a huge, onslaught of the pandemic. And it's not more than the pandemic; is a lack of complete collapse of healthcare. Right. So our study didn't really go into that much detail into healthcare, but I can totally imagine what the situation would be like when you're hit with food insecurity as well as the lack of healthcare. So the conclusions that our study had from last year remain valid for this year, and with greater urgency and with many more, open up the need for many more policy recommendations for this year. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ashwini. It would be nice if we could have discussed some of your points right away, but we'll hold off for the moment if you don't mind, and we'll get back to you. And let's move on to our next presentation. And I would like to turn to Professor Gaurav Dutt, Associate Professor at the Department of Economics, Monash University. Gaurav will present results from a rapid high-frequency survey of rural households in Bihar, which assessed both the economic impact of the pandemic as well as the government-provided support received by households. So, Gaurav, can we start?
Yes, I think we can start. Thank you. Let me just share my screen. Oh, why is... You can't see my screen. I see something else. let's see, let's try again. I'm just going to try. Why is it doing this? I'm sorry, it's playing up. I can see it on
Gaurav,
my
it has come.
Oh, it has come?
It had come.
Okay, okay. Sorry then. Okay, so can you see it?
Yes.
Okay, very good. Okay, thanks. So thank you very much, Pranab, first of all, for moderating this webinar, and also my thanks, like Ashwini as well, to IGC, not only for organizing this webinar, but also actually funding this study, some results from which I'm going to present. And let me also, I mean, this is a study done jointly with the Institute for Human Development, and in particular with Swati Datta and Sunil Mishra from the IHD. So my thanks to them as well, and in fact their whole team for conducting the survey, which is the basis of the findings that I will be talking about. Let me also acknowledge that, you know, it's a bit, it seems a bit odd to be presenting this at a time of really unfolding tragedy in India, which is hard to watch even from a distance. And in some ways we are looking back. I mean, this is, I mean, academics, as academics, we're always playing catch up, but in some ways, you know, the catch up this time around has been quicker, a bit like the vaccines, you know, they've come around quicker than under normal circumstances, but we're still sort of playing catch up. And in coming months, we'll be talking about the impact of what is unfolding at the moment. So the hope is really, as Ashwini also said, that by looking back and documenting what happened, perhaps there are things that we can focus on in dealing with the current situation and how that unfolds. So with that, let me just begin with the basic presentation. So this study is about rural Bihar, and this basically shows the study districts. It covered 7 districts in Bihar. They're kind of well spread out. And it's actually building on work that the IHD has done in these districts over a long period of time. So they actually know this region quite well and have a lot of experience, which actually came in quite handy in actually doing the survey. And I won't dwell too much on the study area, except to note that the initial selection, which goes back many, many years, of these particular districts was done with fairly carefully to try and get a roughly representative picture for Bihar as a whole. So this actually shows just the overall sample. So actually we exceeded our expectations. I mean, we had in the proposal we had put in, you know, we'll try and sample about 1,300 households, and we actually ended up with even a bigger sample. And actually all the credit goes to the team at the IHD who actually painstakingly collected the information. Of course, it was, given the conditions at the time, a phone-based survey. And these are just some of the key dates which are actually useful to keep in mind. Also in terms of when I actually show you the numbers and the impact, you know, what period they relate to. So actually there was a pilot and et cetera in training, but the fieldwork started later than we had anticipated on 23rd of October, and it ended on the 10th of January. And so it's also useful to keep in mind the reference period for many of the impact related questions. So for many questions, our reference period is April to September 2020. Which is sort of the peak of the lockdown and a few months after that. And for some questions, we are worded in terms of since Corona. And actually, this is a phrase I'll be using quite a bit. In fact, a lot of the questions, it was the easiest way to pose them on the phone to rural households was to just ask them since Corona, and they pretty much had a fairly well-defined meaning, although we tried to clarify it, that we are essentially talking about a period starting with the first kind of the Janta curfew of March 22, March 22nd. And for some questions, so the reference period is going to be, essentially since the start of the Janta curfew up to the date of the interview. So just to keep that in mind. So the main focus of the study was really to look at the impact of the pandemic on livelihoods, and in particular the response to the pandemic as well in terms of lockdowns, how it affected rural livelihoods. And excuse me. So we broadly followed the NSS sort of categorization to come up with the livelihood categories. And they're quite self-evident: self-employment in agriculture, self-employment outside of agriculture, the category of regular wage or salaried work, casual labor, either in agriculture or outside agriculture, but other than migrant labor. And then migrant labor was a separate category. And as you will see later, this actually is particularly important for rural households in Bihar. And so it deserved a separate focus. And we'll have a fair bit to say about that. So this is sort of a summary kind of, I may not get to all the details, so it's good to have a summary right in the beginning in terms of what we assessed as the impact in terms of, how, in terms of its, the number and percentage of households who were impacted by different sources of livelihood. So just to walk you through this, essentially, remember that, a particular household may have more than one source of livelihood. So the first column is actually showing the percentage of all rural households who are participating in that particular source of livelihood. And for instance, so the top one, it's about 39% of the households, rural households are self-employed in agriculture or have somebody working as a self-employed person in agriculture. Another 54% have animal husbandry, which is a very large number, but this is actually a bit deceptive. It's never the main source of employment, source of income, but a large number of households have some little animal, or that's the reason why it's so high. And similarly, the other numbers, the important thing to notice, if you add these percentages up, you come up with something like 203. So on average, what that means is that every household had about 2 sources of livelihood out of these different categories. And what is particularly notable is migrant labor. So this is actually very, very high number. 55% of households had at least one migrant worker. Okay. And then this is just the summary of the percentage of households who were affected by Corona. So, and then the last column shows the percentage of those who are affected as a proportion of those who participated in that particular source of livelihood. And first of all, just look at the bottom row. The impact is pervasive. 94% of the households basically report being affected by Corona in one or more of these sources of livelihood. So the impact is really pervasive. And if you look at by source of livelihood, there are 2 categories where the proportion affected, conditional on participation in that source of livelihood, is small. So 16 or 17% in the case of animal husbandry, which doesn't seem to have been affected that much. And of course, the regular wage salaried employment shows a smaller proportion as well. But in all the other categories of livelihood or employment, it's very large percentages of households are affected in one way or another. And in casual labor, basically any household that had any casual labor reported being affected. And overall, about 94% of households participating in, which is basically because everybody is participating in some activity or another. So about 94% of households are. So the effect is completely pervasive, virtually nobody is spared. And that's sort of one principal finding. And there is this important variation across different sources of livelihood. It's also notable that if you look at migrant labor, households that have one or more migrant worker, 94% of those households report being affected. So huge, huge impacts. Now, what are these impacts? I won't have enough time to go through. There's a lot of rich detail, and I'm actually particularly grateful to our survey team and the whole effort in collecting a lot of interesting information, rich information. But I'll walk you through some of the categories to understand what we mean by being affected, and how did we go about asking about that, and what did we learn. So this, beginning with agriculture, I mean, this is quite detailed. Again, I'll probably rush through some of these things and maybe skip some of them. So this is, we looked separately at for Rabi crop, the households that harvested a Rabi crop over this period, April to September. And if you look at, because there's some households were harvesting a Rabi crop, others were in the process of planting a Kharif crop, and we actually distinguish between the two. So one of the things we asked about was whether any of the agricultural operations for households that harvested a Rabi crop during this period, whether any of the agricultural operations, they had unusual difficulty in conducting. And as you can see, 85% of the households reported some difficulty, at least with one operation. And especially related to harvesting, 70%, threshing, winnowing, another 70%, and marketing and selling, again, another 53%. So, and that has had an impact in terms of, their estimate of the harvest loss and sale loss. So of all the households, this is not harvesting households, this is of all the households, 22% of them said that their harvest was affected. Median percentage estimated harvested loss was 20%. And of the households, and that's a much larger proportion of the households who were actually harvesting households. And similarly, the sales were also affected, and the median impact on the percentage loss of sale was about 15%. So large impacts. Kharif, these are impacts on households who had cultivated but not harvested yet a Kharif crop, because the harvest obviously was going to happen later. And again, they also report disruption of operations, about 60%. So actually, in fact, this data, this part of the data is actually also debunks the myth that, agriculture was not affected. And at least what we are finding, at least for rural Bihar, is that that wouldn't necessarily be a correct statement to make. There were ways in which agricultural activities were also affected. And again, the losses are a bit less in terms of percentage of households reporting reduction in the cultivated area, about 11%. And again, the median expected loss in cultivated area and in production is about 20%. These are medians, and of course, there's much more detail. There's a whole distribution of these things as well. Okay, moving on quickly to self-employed and non-agriculture. So this is reporting one type of impact, which is just business closure. And I mean, we're not talking about big business here. These are small little enterprises most of the time. And as you can see, about 80% of the households who are engaged as have some member working as in self-employment in non-agriculture, 80% reported business being closed for some time. And very a small proportion reported business being closed permanently, but altogether about 80% of the households had either permanent or partial closure. And again, the median number of weeks, if closed for some time, and the median is about 6 weeks. So 6 weeks of closure as the median. The maximum is about 28 weeks. Unusual difficulties in business operations. Again, I won't go through the detail. All kinds of things, lack of finance, supply chain problems, lack of demand, unable to maintain normal opening hours. And some of them are still being experienced at the time of the survey. Our first question was, have you experienced since Corona any time? But then also asked about whether they were still experiencing. So depending upon when they were interviewed, a large proportion, 52% were still experiencing some difficulty. And we also had an estimate of income before and after Corona, and about 25% loss of business income as well as an estimate, as a median estimate. Regular wage salaried workers, they were the most protected of the lot, as you might guess, actually. So having a regular job was like an insurance mechanism. But as it turns out, very few households had a regular job. So only less than 8% of households had a worker who was in a regular job, either with a government job or a private job. And government jobs are the most secure. So when we asked, does the worker still have the same job since Corona? Anybody who had a government job, they retained it. Whereas actually in the private sector, still there is not an insignificant actually loss of job. And in fact, the way the questionnaire was framed, this you will see in some of the other slides too. Whenever we talk about individual workers, we asked for up to 2 workers who are either who have that source of livelihood. So we had a first regular worker, and some households also reported a second regular worker. So that's why sometimes you'll see these columns, first and second worker. And so moving on, casual employment was actually one of the hardest hit among the categories of livelihood. And Manrega was actually a saving grace, but even Manrega was actually not quite spared. And what this is showing is the percentage of casual labor households reporting impact of Corona. In terms of overall, if you look at 17% of households report Manrega work being adversely affected, and the proportions are much higher for casual labor in agriculture, which is kind of related to the point I think Ashwini was also making. There has been some impact on, there's probably more use of your own labor, and casual work has declined and so on, and same with non-agriculture. And pretty much anybody who was engaged in any household that was engaged in casual labor, 100% of them were affected in one of these ways, or more than one way, even sometimes. And I won't go into the details about and this is giving the probability of Corona impact conditional on engagement in a particular type of work. So conditional on Manrega work, 56% of, you had a 56% probability of being affected, lowest. But if you were engaged in any other type of work, you almost 100% probability of being affected. And what did the effect mean? Meant loss of days of work per month. These are sort of estimates. So firstly, notice that this is again for casual laborers. This is the percentage of households reporting a decrease in total days of casual work per month. So very large numbers, 86, 80, whatever, about 86%. And then what is being reported below is the mean change in the number of days per month. How much did employment decline? And there you can see overall casual work per month, you're losing about 9 days of employment. And this is for the period April to September, if I'm not mistaken, or maybe even up to the time of the survey. I have to check on that. But that's the per month figure. And the biggest chunk is coming, the least amount of changes in Manrega work, which is again, as I said, a saving grace, but big chunks of decline in days of work per month for casual work in agriculture and also in non-agriculture. Migrant workers, and this is actually, of course, we've seen videos and horror stories of what happened with migrant workers. We did collect quite a lot of information on migrant workers. So this is just questions related to what sort of factors were impacting on migrant workers' employment. And again, it's for first migrant worker, and sometimes you have more than one migrant worker. So we asked about a second migrant worker also. You could just focus on the first migrant worker. And so as you can see, these various factors, of course, they add up to more than 100 because the multiple factors sometimes are reported by workers. So 46% reported, worksite being closed or employment terminated by employer. Another 28% suspension of employment by employer. Unable to work due to travel restrictions. Another 73% stopped work due to fear of infection. So these are overlapping reasons, but this gives you some flavor of the kind of things that the workers or the households are reporting, and sometimes the workers themselves, depending upon who we talk to, in terms of how they were affected. And as you know, there was this big exodus from destination areas back to native villages. And so we estimate for our rural households, 56% of migrant workers returned. So massive return migration, 44% about stayed on. And then we went on to ask about, what happened to the stayers and what happened to the ones, the returnees. So impact on stayers, we looked at the loss of work and the decline in remittances from those who stayed on the destination areas. So, in 90%, close to 90% reported some loss of days of work, and 94%, virtually basically all of them reported a decline in remittances they would send home for understandable reasons. The median or the average percentage change in the amount of remittance reported was about, basically cut by half. Okay. Then the returnees, returnees, as you know, this is just showing you when they returned by month. And if you look at the cumulative percentage, a lot of them returned in March, April, May, June, and some in July, and then it's kind of stopped after that. And if you look at by the end of June, 80 of the first migrant workers, and we have similar numbers for the second migrant workers, 87% of the returnees had returned by the end of June. And pretty much 94% had returned by the end of July, and similar numbers for the second migrant worker. Impact on returnees. So we asked them about the loss of days up to the return to the native village. So, they hung around for a period of time. They're returning at different dates. So they're losing work in the meantime. The median loss of working days is 44 and 50 for the second migrant worker. So huge loss of employment. We asked about how they returned. This is sort of interesting. There's all this noise about Shramik trains. We find that only about 1/5 of the workers actually utilized Shramik trains to get back. And they used other trains, bus, truck, other road transport, bicycle. Of course, these add up to more than 100 as well. So there's multiple ways in which they combine different ways of coming back. It took them about 3 days on average. This is the average number of days to complete the return journey. Okay. And the cost of the journey, the median cost of the journey is about 3,000 rupees. Of course, the numbers, there's a huge range to this. I don't know how I'm doing with time. I mean, I think I have, if you permit me, there's some interesting things I still have. How are we going, Pranab? Should I continue or try to wrap up, or? You're muted.
I think you can go on for a little bit longer.
Okay. All right. Thank you for that. And then we asked about, whether some of them actually had unpaid wage arrears at the time of returning. Fortunately, not a large proportion, but still about 10%, just under 10%. And the median amount of arrears among those who had arrears, about 7,000 rupees so it's quite substantial for the ones that actually did have any arrears, so they didn't even get what they were owed. And we asked if they received any other kind of help payment, from the employer. Virtually nobody did. 94% didn't receive anything from the employer at the time of returning. Okay, work situation. What happened once they got to the village, back to their villages? So, and these are migrant workers who returned, and they're still in the native village at the time of the survey, because some of them actually went back by the time, we did our survey, and I'll talk a little bit about them too. So the ones who were still in the village, they were, of the first migrant workers, about 38%, and then there's, survey dates are of course different, but only started late October, as you can see. and going up to beginning of January, first week of January, 40% was still in the village. And they hadn't gone back for whatever reasons, various reasons. And we asked them how many of them found work around the village. Quite a lot did. About 65% found some work in the village. But only a few of them found Manrega work. That's interesting. The migrant workers did not, according to our data at least, not a lot of them found work, Manrega work, but they did find some other wage work. And then of course, a lot of them actually many of them went to just join whatever self-employment activity the households were engaged in. Our estimate of the median days of alternative work after returning, it was about 4 days per week for those who did find work, and only about 65, 2/3 of them found work. So partial work opportunities for them. And then there were those who actually went back to the destination after having come back to the native village, even returned. And actually quite a lot of them went back. 62% of the first migrant workers went back to the destination, and 48% of the second migrant workers went back to their destination area. And we asked them about the number of days they spent in the native village before returning. And the median number of days they spent is close to 140, 150, so almost 5 months they spent before they. And then we also asked of those who had gone back to the destination, but still had not resumed work at the time of the survey. So we went back, and it turns out that about 1/5 of them, and actually more than 1/5 if you count the second workers as well, at the time of the survey, they still had not resumed work, although they had returned to the destination area. So pretty dire conditions. This is just, remember, basically earlier I showed that 94% of the households were affected. And this is further analysis we still need to do. We haven't had the time to do it, but this is just a summary table of any impact of Corona. And while the overall number is 94%, we did look at differential impact, at least in terms of any impact. And we don't find much difference across, SC/ST, OBC1, OBC2, upper caste, and Muslims. I mean, there is some indication of, 97% of SC/ST compared to upper caste, 91%, but there isn't a big gradient there. Similarly, with regards to income group, we asked them, what their household income was. It's really just one summary question. So it's this type of survey, it just wasn't possible to have anything more ambitious than that. And we categorize into these lowest, low, middle, and top. And even the top is more than 20,000 rupees per month per household. So it's not a lot of a big, and the lowest is less than 5,000 rupees per household per month. And this sort of gives you the distribution. But in terms of the percentage of households impacted, again, we don't see much gradient, actually. In fact, it's quite high. But the low category seems to have a bit higher than the top. There is some element of regressivity, but not. I wouldn't want to make much out of it, of that. Now, just 3 or 4 slides on government assistance. And actually, this is not. I mean, there is still some data to be analyzed, but it'll give you a flavor of what the sort of things we are finding. So if you recall, one of the elements of the package was this free additional ration. And it was basically free additional ration. It was supposed to be 5 kgs of wheat or rice per person and 1 kg of pulses per household per month. And it was meant to be for 3 months, and then it was later extended for another 5 months up to November. It was initially meant to be for April, May, and June, but extended up to November. So we collected information on what households actually received, and this is actually quite important. I mean, I think there is still only relatively limited ground level information on how much of these announced measures are actually reaching the households. And of course, this is just Bihar and sort of just one study, but it gives us some indication. So I think many received nothing. I mean, the thing is that this is the point that Ashwini made as well. I mean, 18.4% of households do not have a ration card. So they were just completely out, because they just don't even have a ration card. So they didn't get anything. Then with the ration card, actually quite a lot, mostly people did receive something. but still there was a small amount of percentage of households who, even with the ration card, didn't receive. This is talking about rice and wheat, about 1.5% of households, or about 2% of households who had a ration card did not receive anything. And 78% actually received less than what even the government said, they were supposed to receive, which is 5 kgs of wheat or rice per person per month. And they received less than that. There was actually a few who received even a little bit more, or most of them received 5 kg, but some even received a bit more. The median amount received among the recipients was about 3.3 kilos and 75 grams, 750 grams. So about 3/4 of what they should have got if they got it, is what they received.
Rob, we need to wind up. So can you?
Yeah. Okay.
But this is very
important.
important.
Let me just skip a little bit.
Really important. So I would just suggest you speed it up a little bit.
Yeah, I'll speed it up. I don't have too many more things to present actually. The same story with the pulses as well. And the other thing, this is also quite interesting. We wanted to know whether actually, this was supposed to be additional to their regular normal PDS quota, were they getting the normal PDS quota or not? Or was it displacing to some extent? And it seems like, when we asked whether they received their full, how many of the household received their full PDS ration, so that, this is truly additional. It turns out 51% only received their full PDS ration. So there seems to be some evidence of displacement. In fact, people who received their full free ration, there the proportion was a bit higher. Other who did not receive their full ration was higher, and the ones who received their full ration was even lower, 46%. So there seems to be certainly this potential displacement of free ration, of PDS ration by free ration. 51% of the cardholders not receiving their regular ration is a bit concerning. Free cooking gas, again, this was under this Ujjwala scheme. They were supposed to receive, a free LPG cylinder, 1 per month for 3 months. And again, 52% of the households are not even registered under this Ujjwala scheme in rural Bihar, so they're just out completely. Another, just about 20%, they are eligible but receive nothing. And many of them receive 1 cylinder, although they're supposed to receive 3. So 3 or more is only a very few, but still 12% of households receive 3 or more cylinders. Some even receive 4. Jan Dhan accounts. So again, this was supposed to be a cash transfer of 500 rupees per month for 3 months into Jan Dhan bank accounts held by women. 31% of the households have no women Jan Dhan accounts, so they were just out. Among the percentage of households with Jan Dhan accounts, this is just a frequency distribution of the amount received over the 3-month period. So they should have received 1,500. And actually quite of the ones that did have Jan Dhan accounts, actually quite a few did receive, 2/3 of them did receive that amount. But I think the important point to make, which was, we don't need data to make that point, is that the amount of assistance was too low, and the average transfer per Jan Dhan account over a 3-month period was 1,226 rupees, which comes down to, if you look at it on a per day basis, 13 rupees per household per day. And that speaks for itself, the level of assistance. So just summing up very quick, I've taken too much time. So pervasive and deep impact of Corona, nearly every rural household affected, often affected in multiple ways. Large and prolonged impacts in so many cases, especially for casual labor and migrant workers. Government assistance by and large limited. A very significant fraction of excluded households. Many simply outside the eligible categories. Some received nothing despite being eligible. And among the lucky ones who did receive something, there's a large fraction who received less than the announced amounts. And in the case of free rations, there's evidence of displacement of regular ration, as I mentioned, and the average amount of assistance is quite niggardly relative to the enormity of the economic impact. So let me just stop here. I've taken quite a lot of time. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Gaurav. Now, we had originally two panelists to discuss the papers that have been presented. Unfortunately, Shri Sanjay Kumar was unable to make it because of the epidemic within that has affected his family, and he had to go to the hospital. But we are very fortunate to have with us Madam Harjot Kaur. And there you are.
Yeah, hi.
Hi, how are you?
I'm
So,
fine.
so the responsibility for taking the discussion forward is primarily yours and partly mine.
Yeah, sure. Okay.
So can I ask you to lead off the discussion, and then I'll come in and maybe we can swap it back and forth together.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. As we've just been taking walk through two presentations by Madam Ashwini Deshpande and Shri Gaurav Dutt, and they've both talked about the impact of the pandemic on the households in Bihar, especially regarding, one was about the various cash transfers or the income, how it has affected the income of people in Bihar, and also how it is also affecting how the SHGs have been helping in the pandemic. So based on my experience as the Managing Director of the Women's Development Corporation, I would like to say a few things about the topic. Number one, the pandemic affects women directly and most harshly, as has been generally I think the verdict all across the world. Women are at the receiving end of any calamity, and the coronavirus pandemic is no exception. So the impact on women, if we do a household analysis in that way, is definitely much more than anything else. It has also resulted in many unforeseen consequences, like the increase in domestic violence against women, because the moment the mobility of the women is affected, she is unable to move out of the household, then she is at the receiving end of everybody's frustrations, be it because of loss of a job, loss of income, or trying conditions, health problems, and her care responsibilities increase tremendously. She has to take care of each and every person in the household, right from the old parents of a migrant labor to the children and other people. And as Madam had said about food security, I think even if we talk about food security, the women comes last in the household. She is the last one to be fed, even if the plate is very small. So she has an issue on that. And her communication abilities with the world or with others also takes a hit. Women are basically in India, I think, or in the Southeast Asian countries, I think the social network helps women more than the government network. So it is per se, the people in the village or her friends or her neighbors who come to her rescue when she's in dire trouble. But the pandemic affects that also. Thanks to the coronavirus, even your neighbors are not willing to come into your household and interfere. Nobody is willing to even come, even during a death in your family, as we are saying increasingly in the newspapers, how it is making dehumanizing the human race, literally. So that also affects her very badly. And of course, if we talk about the gender divide, of course, she is affected, but then more than that, she's also divided by the digital divide. She has no access or very little access to digital resources like a phone or forget about a tablet or anything. So coming from adolescent girls to women, adolescent girls are unable to continue their studies or education. That is a major impact. And as for women, they are unable to take any effect or any access any of the digital portals of the government and access any of the schemes that they can definitely benefit from if they are able to get their access to it. So even conditional grant transfers, of course, it's given by DBT. And despite what the panel has been saying, I think Bihar did a better job in doing DBT transfers to affected households than many other states. And as far as the social welfare department is concerned and the food and civil supplies departments is concerned, transfers of food and transfers of cash transfers to households, whether it was pensions, whether it was ICDS money, whether it was other kind of things, has been done to the fullest by the department. I would also like to say, though, it is good to say that you should have a universal PDS or a cash transfer, not linked to Aadhaar. I think the government experience says otherwise. The whole aspect of linking it with Aadhaar was to screen out the so-called middlemen or people who were not eligible for that kind of a grant and who were making money from it. And believe me, in Bihar, when we Aadhaar linked the whole ration cards and anything, I think there has been a saving of many million rupees. And many people have just moved out of the screen totally when that Aadhaar link has happened. If you stop the Aadhaar link, then you're not very sure whether that money is actually going to the beneficiary or it is actually going into somebody else's pocket. That is also a big problem because in a pandemic, nobody is even going to check physically door to door whether they have actually received that money. That will happen after, say, when the pandemic decreases and you are able to move house to house, only then. But there is a difference between the pandemic last time and this time. Despite what figures are saying, last time we in Bihar, of course, the income was definitely affected by the pandemic very badly. But the pandemic as such had not spread much in the rural areas of Bihar last time. But this time that exception has also gone. This time the health pandemic, which we are seeing or we are in the midst of it now, is moving across rural Bihar and is creating a lot of havoc. So it's not only loss of income this time, it's loss of lives this time. And that's going to have even a much more major impact because the only person or the only person who was the breadwinner of that family, if that person dies, then the family is definitely being pushed into poverty or into very, very dire circumstances. So this time, even that pandemic is happening there. So things are very, very gloomy at this point of time, I must say. And I think we all have to sit together and find some kind of policy changes or even objectives as to how to move ahead in this kind of a scenario, because this is something which has been faced by all countries in the world. And we saw similar pictures of the US, Spain, Italy, and many other places. But at that time, I think we, the smug Indians, were very happy thinking that we've somehow defeated the pandemic. It didn't affect us so badly. But I think this time we've been caught in our task. And as we always used to brush it under the carpet, that our health infrastructure, as people used to say, will not be able to take the load of a pandemic in India. And we used to think, okay, no, that will not happen because that didn't happen last year. But this year, that nightmare is now being seen everywhere in all cities and in all states of India. So this time it's also much more problematic for a government because the government and the whole machinery is more geared towards this time in saving lives rather than livelihoods at this point of time. So between lives and livelihoods, without livelihoods as it is, people will be affected, and without lives, I think it'll hardly be a question of a livelihood. So it's a catch-22 situation as far as governments are concerned at this point of time. The whole machinery is involved in making COVID hospitals, providing oxygens, ensuring that medicines are reaching on time, ensuring that oxygen supplies are not stopped at any circumstances. And of course, at the meantime, also ensuring that all the helplines are working and people are given their food transfers and DBT. And people who are living in shelter homes and things like that are also taken care of, and nobody is left in the lurch. But it's a very bad situation at this point of time. Thank you. I think I'll.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Yeah, I think you did open up a whole bunch of issues. And before I'd like to make just a couple of comments and questions. I mean, in particular, Ashwini, your analysis suggests that insecurity went up pretty substantially. Um, Following question: did you actually find out which is the allocation by each ration shop is actually determined by the number of ration with that shop. That's the modality through which. How does the supply problem get taken care of? The demand side can shift from one shop to another at will, but supplies can't. I mean, it has to go through a system. And I think that was the point that Harjot was trying to make. So, I mean, I'm very curious because, we are saying that Onur didn't work, but frankly, I don't think any of us expected it to work because of the logistical issues that are involved. The second part of the question, which was really about the free rations. Gaurav's paper suggested that most people did get free rations, although not to the full extent. The exclusion was actually fairly small in terms of people who didn't get it at all, and some got more. Fair enough. The real question there is, I'm not very clear. And perhaps Harjot, you can answer this. I don't know. Does a household have the right, or a ration card holder have the right, to draw his free ration first and then decide how much of the regular ration PDS allocation he wishes to buy? Or is the provision of free ration the PDS quota in the way a family would organize its finances when it's? Your presentation was very interesting because I think all of us shared Harjot's point of view that in the first wave of in India, rural India is for a lot of the work that has been going on. What your analysis is suggesting is that's not true at all, at least certainly not in Bihar. That whether or not the pandemic affected lives, it certainly seemed to have affected livelihoods in rural. It affected actually agriculture. The old narrative, I heard, if you can correct me, the old narrative was Bihar received so many returned migrants that they really had labor to spare. And therefore, where was the problem of getting your harvesting and threshing and all of that done? What is the reason for it? So I turn it back to you, and whoever, and Harjot, please feel free to come in. Ashwini, Gaurav, over to you.
I can just start by just answering a few questions, the comments that came. So one is that just to clarify, our survey was done in Madhya Pradesh, not in Bihar. So the results are all from Madhya Pradesh.
Yeah, I know. I know that.
Sorry? Yeah. No, I just thought in case somebody joined late.
Yeah, I know that.
Just to clarify that ours, unlike Gaurav's survey, our survey was in Madhya Pradesh. The second factual clarification is that the universalization or the delinking from Aadhaar I was talking about in the context of food rations, not in the context of cash disbursements, because cash anyway is going to the bank account. So, the question of leakage there is harder because you have to link the bank account to a particular system. So anyway, that was not what I was talking about. The point about food security, Pranav, is we didn't So the way we use the term food security is not really only about PDS, although I know that in the popular policy discourse, that's the way it's used. Food security, we're taking just in a wide sense of, did people have enough food, and or did they change their food consumption habits to accommodate hardship? Right. So what changed in the way they were eating in order to cope with the economic crisis? Did they eat cheaper food? Did they eat fewer meals? And what were the things that they did? And so that's what, those were our questions. In terms of PDS per se, we included all food in the question. We did not focus only on PDS, because at the end of the day, what we wanted to find out was, were people getting enough to eat, or were they making substantial adjustments to just eat even less than what they were eating before? So how did the PDS change in a particular village? I don't think that our survey would have been able to answer that. In any case, it was a phone survey. That was just because of the lockdown situation. So we couldn't actually go to the PDS shop, and getting the phone number of the PDS person and what he'll tell you on the phone, we don't know how accurate it is. So it was harder to design, just on the question of the PDS. On the question of universalization of food grains disbursement, I mean, I understand the concern about leakages, or I understand the concern about misappropriation, but the question is simply, you want food to reach the maximum amount of people. You don't want people to go without food or go with very little food. Any policy that you choose, there might be some errors of inclusion or exclusion. What is the policy that's going to minimize that error? I don't think it's going to be possible to have a policy where it's 100% no mistakes get made. Mistakes do get made. And what is the where is it going to be the case where you minimize the errors? And I think universalizing PDS, you do minimize the errors. I think now the more you try to define the beneficiary through a series of criteria, the more likely that beneficiaries are going to get excluded, because to show that you're eligible for the criteria, you need more paperwork, you need more documentation, you need to prove that you belong to a particular category. So the greater the number of hurdles you put in, and even if you thought that it was okay in a regular time, certainly not during the pandemic when people are battling with so much else. Then in addition, you have to prove all this documentation to say that you are eligible for minimum amount of PDS rations. Certainly I and my team members and many others, we believe that universal, and many people have argued in this way. Jean works with the Right to Food campaign. Many people have said that universalizing PDS is not going to lead to the kinds of leaks that used to happen earlier. Certainly not in the time of the pandemic. So even economists who otherwise are very careful about error, exclusions, etc. I mean, even Abhijit Banerjee last year said that this is not the time to worry about whether you can produce that document to show that you're eligible. It's hard already, So that's really the point that I was making about the food security.
If I could respond to what you're saying, madam, with the permission of the chair, of course, Mr. Sen. What you're saying is does make sense in the pandemic as such, when you're saying that you make it universal, and even if that person is not able to show the document, give him the rations. But what about the bureaucracy? Where do we go? We are taken to task that little sheet of paper is not there. Nobody is giving us the leeway that, okay, we found the person wanting, we thought that he was needy and we gave him the money, or we gave him the food transfers. We are the so-called the babus of India, who are not supposed to be delivering anything anytime, let alone the pandemic. We are the bad guys in the whole country. We seem to be keeping the country back on everything like that. But then when you're talking about a system like that, then think about the pure bureaucracy also. Do we also get the benefit of not showing that document to the government in power and saying that, okay, we distributed it well, you do a social audit later on. But if we are not able to show that paper, let alone to our government or the government of India, we will not get those allocations of food grains from anywhere. we do have to show that data. We do have to give those data first, only then that allocation is made based on that. The allocation is made on numbers. It's a simple number game in India. So universalization of this thing. The other thing is resources, madam. As it is, government of Bihar, or Bihar is one of the poorest states in the country. If we had the resources like a European Union, we could be doing a lot of things for a lot of people. We had that surplus resources. We are already hand on mouth. Our resource transfers are at least, I think Mr. Pranab Sen will definitely vouch for me. We have the largest transfers from government of India, and we live on those doles. We are totally dependent on government of India, whether it is for food grains or for money. So as far as we are concerned, whatever resources we are able to get at this particular time, I think each and every government is spending each and every money worth now on health, on getting doctors, nurses, and things like that, medicines, remdesivir, banana, dakana, oxygen, everything is. That is the main priority today, and everybody is crying hoarse for that, whether it is from the rural areas or this. So I'm all for universalization of PDS. I think when I joined the service, it was quite universal, but many people down the line have criticized it so badly that it kept on shrinking every time with every economic report that we got that exclude this, and this is not right. And what is happening in India is that the whole systems are made more on exclusions rather than inclusions because of the fact that we do not believe in our own bureaucracy. We think we still are the British rulers. We do not want to have any faith in our own bureaucracy. I'm sorry, but
Well
the
said.
hard reality
I
cuts both ways.
think it's a very good point, and I absolutely salute so many hardworking members of the bureaucracy. It's amazing, when you work actually when you do a field survey, or I worked in Maharashtra also, the number of bureaucrats who were there to make a difference, very, very highly dedicated individuals. So there's a very large section of the bureaucracy that is extremely hardworking and extremely dedicated. But these decisions, you're absolutely right, they can't be taken at the level of the bureaucracy. They have to be, these are political decisions, have to be taken at the level of the government. Absolutely correct.
Yeah.
Gaurav, can I ask you to come in, please?
Yeah, sure. A couple of points, actually. One, a couple of points in relation to some of the things you were saying, Pranab. So firstly, actually, I just wanted to say that, you asking Harjot about, whether a household or individual has the option of declining normal PDS ration if they've got the free ration or taking a lesser amount. I think the one thing to note is that the amount of free ration is not that huge compared to it's only a small proportion of the PDS entitlement. So while it's still conceivable that some households may reduce or may want to have less of their PDS ration. I mean, some anyway don't utilize it to the full extent anyway. But that I think it's quite inframarginal, the amount of transfer that the government actually announced. So I don't think that's really, in my mind, a big concern. Okay. And from that point of view, I am still a bit concerned by the fact that a lot of the people, there's, exclusion you think is small. Okay, 20% of the households didn't get it because they don't, 20% or 18% don't even have a ration card. Maybe it's not large, but if everybody is affected and some impacts are quite widespread, I mean, and these are not really even the top bracket in rural areas is not particularly rich. So the impacts are substantial. 20% is not something, just to be completely ignored. That's one point. Second is that I am still concerned by the fact that 50% of them said they didn't get their normal ration. So that is raising, in my mind, some 50% of the households, they said that they didn't get their normal ration. So, was it that because, you go to the shop, you got your free ration, say, oh, wo to le to liya tumne, aur kya, or abhi itna hi le lo, abhi kam le lo, or something, I think one can't say that conclusively, but these numbers are suggestive of some sort of phenomenon perhaps going on. So that was sort of and then the issue of universalization, I agree. I mean, I think these are large political decisions, and I think there is I think you make a fair point, Harjot. One of the, where does the bureaucracy stand? That's one issue. And the other issue is also to do with the fact that even if it's universal, does it necessarily mean that everybody does get it in the end? Or will it again get siphoned off to biscuit factories or something, or not, even though it's universal? Of course, the counter argument to that often that's given is that once people know it's universal, they'll demand it more, and there'll be more kind of, accountability demanded by people, and that'll reduce the leakage. So that's sort of the other argument. But in my mind, actually, this debate is still open in terms of, and people are divided on that. I know Jean thinks in one way and some other people think a different way. The debate over cash transfers versus, in-kind transfers in food. I think that debate is still an open issue. And I think the jury is still out in terms of whether, if we can, there are of course problems with the cash transfer system too, but there is some potential also for the cash transfer system to work better, perhaps. But some of the logistical problems are still going to be the same ones. I mean, how do you make cash transfers and so on? So and one last point, and then I'll shut up. And on the shortage of labor, I mean, I think, this is, I was a bit surprised by some of the findings here that, of so much reported disruption of, the Kharif and the Rabi crop operations. And while it's true that the migrant workers did come back in significant numbers, I think, for one thing, the flow is staggered, and perhaps some of these operations are sort of kind of time sensitive. And perhaps, I don't know the answer to that, but it's not entirely inconceivable that there were difficulties in conducting certain agricultural operations in spite of the return flow of migrants. And but again, these are sort of things that, in fact, again, the limitations of the phone service, some of these things perhaps is going to be difficult to delve deeply into. But there's still, I think, important issues, the reality is still pretty tough, as many people, everybody realizes. So some of these issues are probably still going to be with us. And so to that extent, some of this work perhaps at least is helpful in thinking about, well, what next type of questions as well. So let me just stop here.
Pranab, can I just make one tiny comment?
Harjot, can I just?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, go ahead, Ashwini.
No, just Gaurav, the cash versus kind, at least in the time of the pandemic, nobody, maybe some people were, but more or less all of us were arguing for cash and kind, because the two are not substitutes, and I think both were needed, just to be clear.
Yes, yeah. Sure.
No, in fact, what I wanted to ask Harjot was as a follow-up to something she said, which I think is extremely important, that this time around, rural Bihar is going to be seeing a lot more infections and a lot more deaths, right?
Yes.
Which means your system of identifying beneficiaries will need to take that into account. That is, you will need to be able to identify households where income earners have been adversely affected. Do such systems exist? Is there any thought about putting such a system in place?
I would like to say, I'll just give a reply to all the various questions being raised. Of course, as Madam Ashwini has said, that of course cash plus kind transfers are needed in a pandemic. But when the supply chains get disrupted, when the machinery which is supposed to supply or to distribute the food to the households are themselves corona affected or in hospital or are literally non-existent at this point of time, then I think the only transfer today is a cash transfer, because this pandemic is like something which we've not seen ever in our history. This is something which affects everybody. So you find your A&M workers are affected, they're dying. You find Anganwadi workers are going out and they themselves are affected, their household is affected. You'll find health workers, as you said, frontline health workers are very badly hit. Doctors are hit, nurses are hit, administration is hit. We are losing officers every day from each and every service, right from the down at the rural level to the As you all know, we also recently lost our chief secretary in Bihar itself. So with this kind of a pandemic where the person concerned who's supposed to have the responsibility of delivery is also fighting for his or her own life, I think cash transfers is the only answer. At least the cash is deposited in your bank accounts. You can take it out and you can definitely use it in the villages. And definitely in the village, there is no shortage of food. If you have the money, you can still buy it. At least the food is available to a large extent. I think the food shortage is going to be more in the urban areas with the lockdowns, where you just don't have anything to whatever you have in your households. You have to basically subsist on that, whatever things are available in that. So definitely in normal circumstances, I would say cash transfers is not one of, I personally always have felt that cash transfer is not the need for India. It is more of a kind of a transfer, because a long time ago also we used to have food for work, in which people used to work and we used to give them rations, either rice or wheat, whatever it was. And they were much more happier than that. They used to say, we don't want money, we want food. But at this point of time, I think the pandemic is literally forcing ourselves, forcing our hands. We do not have any other systems in place to actually ensure that those things happen on time. Coming to Mr. Gaurav, this thing, yes, 20% is a very big amount. Any person not having any food and sleeping in the night is criminal. It's something which none of us can justify in any way, whether it is a measly 10% or a 20%. We know we are a billion-plus country, but still, if we cannot even provide the basics of food, water, and health to our citizens, then what are we here for in the first instance? And we need to wake up. It's been a long time. We are quite an old democracy now. We can't even say that we've just come out of our, come into our independence. We are still groping. I think we need to get our act together. The poor people are not going to be there forever. If we do not feed them today, he's not going to be there around after 6 months when the government wakes up and says, "Acha khana to de dijiye." He'll be gone by that time. Khana to roz chahiye. वो तो जरूरत है basic, उसके बगैर आदमी नहीं जी सकता है. So food, of course. So I'm not saying that we are heartless. We are very sensitive to that also. But we are looking at the overall picture, and despite everything, we do not have a magic wand to see that thing shrinks from say 20% to 0.2%. We would be very happy if it goes that way. But at this point of time, that's happening. Regarding universalization of PDS, I think we are looking at the wrong end of the road. We should not have universalization of PDS. This is a disaster. We should call it as disaster in the first sense, called a disaster emergency in India. Give the states that power, or the states can take it themselves and generally say that, yes, this is a disaster, just like a flood or anything. This is a medical disaster. And then when that disaster thing is happening, then this whole aspect of exclusiveness goes. Then it is that affected village, each and every person in that household or in that person in that village will get that rations, irrespective of his economic status or anything else. That is what is required at this point of time, because whether it is the rich or the poor, they are both equally affected. If you have the money, you've spent it on getting oxygens or trying to get a bed or trying to save your near and dear ones. And believe me, it's a horrific story. It's a human disaster. We've seen full households being wiped out, parents, children, 4 or 5 people gone in one household. Nobody is left even for a cash transfer or a kind transfer. And then, of course, getting yourself cremated itself is another possibility. Somebody else will have to do it for you, because in India, you can't cremate yourself after you've already died. So that also is another issue. So the problem is very thin, and I think we really need to think out of box now, because what we've been thinking all these years about different pandemics or different kind of emergencies, this pandemic is totally different. It doesn't even give you a leeway of going this way or that way. We are like caught in a box. We don't know which side to go and what to do at this point of time, how to reach that person. And the supply logistics are like mind-boggling. As it is with the lockdown, many things are like taken care of, but the police and the administration is like hard-pressed and working 24/7 just to deliver the health issues or look after the basic other kind of issues about ensuring that at least nobody dies not because of COVID, but because of hunger also. So I think just ensuring that nobody dies of hunger and hopefully nobody dies of the coronavirus is a very big task for the administration at this point of time. And believe me, from the state government down to the district level or down to the village level, I think we are all fighting a very hard battle and paying a very high price for it, because we are seeing very young officers losing their lives. We are seeing more and more ANMs and our frontline workers dying. So, and then we are coming up with policies that we will have doctors, we will appoint doctors for 3 months or ANMs or anybody for 3 months. Who will be willing to risk their lives 3 months on a contract job?
Thank you. Thank you.
For 7,000
Now,
rupees.
Can I now open this up to the floor? Kumar, are there any questions? Anybody wants to ask a question?
Dr. Sen, all the questions I think already answered because it's with you in the chat box option.
This is my understanding. I saw have been all answered.
Yep, I think
So
all right.
if there are no questions, then let me just try and wind it up by asking the other panelists essentially one question. And you will each probably answer it very differently given the perspectives you are coming from, is that the second wave is significantly worse than the first, right? What we've done is we've analyzed the first wave. We've gotten certain takeaways from it. The question is that what do these takeaways imply about our collective response to the second wave? Is there any specific learnings that you would want to bring out very clearly and state it in terms of policy? Harjot, you'll come last.
Okay.
Because you'll have to respond. So let the other two come with it and then we go to you. So I'll start with Gaurav.
Yeah, no, it's a hard question, but I'll take a stab at it. I think, as we all understand, I mean, in the first instance, I mean, the situation is so grim that there is a health or lives emergency that's, still rampaging, So in some ways, I remember, listening to Jeff Sachs, at the start of the pandemic early on, last year. And he basically made the point that, you're not going to take care of the economic side of things till you take care of bring the basic health side or the, spread of the virus under some control. So I think this is priority number one. And I frankly, I mean, it's really, I think like many others, I think, there is a complete kind of collapse of management, especially at the central government level. And I mean, it seems like, it's just been left to the state governments to find their own way around things and so on. And even most of them are struggling and so on. So, I mean, I don't know what's feasible, but, that's, whether you need to bring in your armed forces and, to try and organize the organization, supply and logistics of supply of oxygen or whatever the paramount needs are. I mean, you do them, take it like, they deliver all kinds of ammunition to all kinds of places all around in a war setting. I mean, this is a war type situation. So I think this is the first order priority. I don't have any answers, but I think you need to muster up whatever organizational capacity we have or delivery capacity we have, including and especially including armed forces, to get them into action, to solve some of the logistical distribution problems. I think it's oxygen too. I think a big issue is really, one is the aggregate supply. The other is really you don't have distribution assets to get them from one place to another. I think central government should step in to do that. The other, that's one side of things where I just think that, it's high time that we utilize some of these resources, for that purpose. to the extent that's feasible. I mean, maybe it's even that's pie in the sky kind of thinking. Second thing I would say is that, one thing we do learn from some of this work, and not just ours, but lots of other studies too. I think in this context, it seems to me that, and I agree there with Harjot completely, a significant amount of kind of cash transfer, and as universal as possible, is actually an important step to take right away without waiting for anything, and go beyond the piddly amounts that you've given last time. I mean, and we'll worry about, there are things, I mean, I can talk a lot about the deficit issue and so on there, and I have my own views on that. But this is not the time to worry about that. And I think this is the quickest way of delivering some measure of support. I mean, cash is not going to solve all the problems, but I think a huge kind of cash transfer. I mean, a lot of people actually, fortunately, a lot of people do have bank accounts in India. Yeah, there is still the excluded population's problem there who don't have bank accounts, but I think most of them do use that. And the central government needs to step in with a huge cash transfer. I mean, I can't imagine an amount, but some reasonable amount, much bigger than it was done last time. Those two things, I think I'll just stop here.
Ashwini?
Yeah, so this is a national emergency. So first of all, to leave the states to fend for themselves is not the order of the day. It is something that the central government has to decisively step in. Last year in the budget, this year in the budget, announcements were made about 35,000 crores for vaccination, the PM cares money, etc. So I think there's also the need for transparency and declaring where that money has been spent, who's getting it. We just recently did a story in the CEDA on allocation of vaccination, which is already slow. But there's a huge disparity in the interstate allocation of vaccines for no reason at all. We don't see any pattern that explains that disparity in vaccination, right? So this is the time when the central government has to think of all the people of India living in any state of the country as citizens of India. That's number one. Second thing is that accountability goes hand in hand with the ability for people to register their, so supposing there's a complaint, I want an oxygen cylinder, I'm not getting it. But if I raise that issue, would I then be at the risk of being punished for raising the issue? So I think freedom of inquiry and allowing people to raise a concern in the situation of emergency will, I think, improve delivery. It cannot hamper delivery. So I think these are very important elements to keep in mind. Finally, the cash transfer amount last year that we had calculated, we had said 6,000 rupees per family of 5. Today, it might even be more. And many people have done the fiscal calculations on this. This is not an impossible amount for the government of India to bear. Larger amounts than this, these are also possible. So if you leave it to the state government, I totally see all the concerns that Madam Bumrah has pointed out. But this should not be left to the state governments. The center has to step in. There was a window of time when the caseload was really low. That was a time when all of this preparation should have been done. It was not done, but it's still all right to accept that and now rectify, rather than just pretend that problem will take care of itself.
Harjot, what kind of a cooperation model would you suggest? Both the other speakers are suggesting a large central presence. How would you react, and how would you be able to give us an alternative model for cooperation between the center and states?
Yeah, definitely. First of all, I would agree we should first of all declare it as such to be a national emergency or a national disaster, because the disaster norms are then different, and it gives a lot of flexibility to many states to do a lot of things as far as disasters is concerned. The second is to increase our vaccination drive so that we are able to vaccinate large number, crores and crores of people, as the experts are already predicting a third wave in the middle of September, which would be affecting children more this time, as they're saying, first the elderly and then the youngsters, and now the children are the next source. So we really need to go very hard on our vaccination drive, ensure that our vaccinations, we are able to get our vaccine production high. And for that, I think the government of India, if you declare a disaster, then you can definitely ask many private companies also to chip in a national disaster and share that formula with them and ask them also to make vaccines. There are many other companies making vaccines in India. And given the potential of the number of vaccines that we want, I think we definitely have to brush up our capacity of production of vaccines, number one. Number two, we should also punish states who have misused their supplies. Case being Tamil Nadu, where a large number of supplies were destroyed for lack of vaccination or poor handling or whatever. I think those are expensive mistakes which a country like India, and especially staring at such a huge pandemic, cannot even think about. Every vial has to go into somebody to ensure that that protective cover is increasing day by day. So we need to do that. Number two, we need to man all our posts of doctors, nurses, midwives, increase those posts definitely, ensure better service conditions for them in the sense that if you say a 3-month kind of a tenure, nobody's going to come, give them a full tenure. As it is in Bihar, we were appointing doctors only on an interview basis. There was no examination or anything. Similarly for others also. So to look at their mark sheets and give them that this thing and give them a job at least for 2 years or 3 years, I think we can definitely afford to do that. Only then somebody will even think of joining the health infrastructure at this point of time. And God forbid, if tomorrow he or she loses his life, they should also have a social net so that their families can also survive this pandemic. So we really need to increase our health capacities plus the infrastructure. We need to have oxygen plants at each and every hospital. It's criminal that why don't hospitals like Apollo, Fortis, and Medanta don't have their own oxygen generation plants? They charge so highly for patients, but they don't even have an oxygen plant for themselves. Pathetic. They should all have, including government sectors, should have oxygen generation plants. And we should have a medical awareness, social awareness campaign on medical awareness. 80% of the so-called patients do not need oxygen if they are treated well, if they take care of their symptoms from day one itself. It is when we think that it's a normal viral fever and we think, मुझे तो corona नहीं हो सकता type of things, and we leave it till the 5th day. Then we start finding that either it affects your chest or it lungs or it affects your blood parameters, and then you end up either going for a pneumonia kind of a problem or you end up with a brain hemorrhage or a heart attack because of blood clotting and things like that. So that is the time when those initial 5 days are the ones. If we are able to keep at least 50% of our population in their households hale and hearty without the drugs and that kind of a thing, not going to the hospitals, we would be in a much better position. As it is, our health infrastructure can't even take 20% of us, rest alone the rest of us. So even if we increase our capacity, we do not have a magic wand that say in 3 months we'll be like the super rich, we'll have 1 hospital bed for each of our population. That is impossible. So we need to have different steps to see that we can keep most of our population hale and hearty and alive in this pandemic. We also need to have a vaccine for children developed very fast, because if children are going to be the next pandemic victims, then I think it will be a social and a national tragedy as this. Number 3, we also need to audit our hospitals. I think we should take over every hospital of ours and all that, and we should audit our hospitals. This increasing demand of oxygen is, of course, very nice. It makes the headlines. It makes all of us stand in this thing that okay, we are the persons who have been mishandling the whole issue. But believe me, I think we really need to audit. What are our hospitals doing? Does anybody who ever goes into the ICU comes back? I have not seen people walking back from the hospital, whether it is a Medanta or it's a PHC or whatever. I think we really need to teach our own doctors and our own nurses about treatment. I don't think people are giving somebody a remedy when he's on a deathbed who is not going to help, or tocilizumab or anything, which is like black marketed for no rhyme and reason. And even for oxygen things, I think the very fact that you're prone and you give the right medicines, your oxygen level improves quite fast, despite the fact you don't need an oxygen cylinder. And giving an oxygen cylinder is only like say ensuring that you are definitely moving towards your deathbed, because without a medicine and oxygen cylinder can do nothing. You will only worsen your condition day by day and move out of it. So I think we need to do that. And of course, central government will have to open its purses and give money to different states as per the disaster norms and people affected. And I think last but not the least, coming from the bureaucracy, it may sound a little funny, but I think we need to keep politics out. It's a pandemic, and if we can keep our citizens first rather than which party we belong to, I think we'll do our human's job of helping ourselves and everybody else. I think in the cremation ground, they hardly care whether you are from Congress or BJP. I think the same end is there for each and every person. So let's forget our political flags and only concentrate on our health issues. And I think we are united Indians. We don't care a damn about which color, which government is in power. What we care about is for our own citizens and our own health and our own country. Jai Hind.
Thank you. Thank you, Arjun.
Thank you.
So I think we've come to the end of our time. May I first give a big round of thanks to all our speakers. All three of you have been fantastic, and I have enjoyed it enormously. I've learned a lot. I thank the audience. They've been very patient. They've all stayed with us right through, and that is very heartening for the speakers and certainly for me. I'd also like to remind everybody that there will be a very brief survey immediately following the presentations. So please take a minute to fill that out later on. And as your feedback is very important to us, it will help us to restructure and improve what we do in the future. I thank you all again, and I really look forward to your feedback. Thank you, all of you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Srinath, and thank you very much, Mr. Gaurav Dutt and Madam Ashwini Deshpande. It was a pleasure to interact with you. Thank you.
It was a pleasure to meet you. Yes.